In Episode 4, titled Reading Requirements Like an Architect, what the question is really asking, we take messy requirements and turn them into clear design actions quickly because the exam is really testing your ability to interpret intent under pressure. A scenario prompt can feel like a pile of unrelated facts, but it is usually a compressed requirements document with just enough detail to rank options. When you read like an architect, you stop treating every sentence as equal and start identifying which lines define success and which lines define constraints. That shift is practical because it reduces the urge to chase technical trivia and replaces it with a structured way to decide what matters first. If you can do this reliably, best answer questions become less about memorization and more about disciplined interpretation. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to the CloudNet X books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A core skill is separating the business outcome from the technical request, because those are often not the same thing, and the exam expects you to notice the difference. The business outcome is what leadership actually cares about, such as reducing downtime, protecting customer data, improving user experience, or expanding into new regions. The technical request is the proposed mechanism, such as move this application to the cloud, add encryption, or improve the network, and it is sometimes a misguided translation of the real need. When you see a technical request, treat it as a hypothesis rather than a mandate and look for the real goal that the request is trying to satisfy. In the exam, the best option often meets the business outcome with less risk than the literal technical request would create. This also helps you avoid getting locked in to a solution too early because you are designing for outcomes, not for slogans. Next, identify constraints explicitly because constraints define what answers are even eligible, and scenario questions often hide constraints in plain language. Compliance constraints can appear as references to audits, regulated data, retention rules, or industry obligations, and they usually raise the importance of logging, access control, and policy enforcement. Geography constraints can appear as user distribution, data residency requirements, regional service availability, or cross-border restrictions, and they affect latency and placement decisions. Latency constraints show up as real-time use cases, complaints about responsiveness, timeouts, or interactive workflows, and they influence where control points can sit without breaking experience. Uptime constraints show up as service-level agreements, safety-critical systems, or customer-facing revenue paths, and they change how you think about redundancy and failover. Operational skill level is often implied by staffing, tool familiarity, or prior outages, and it determines whether a complex design is realistic or reckless. Pay attention to what is missing, because missing details signal risk assumptions, and the exam often tests whether you recognize those assumptions without inventing facts. If a scenario does not specify data classification, you should not assume the highest sensitivity, but you also should not assume that security can be ignored. If a scenario does not specify bandwidth, you should not confidently choose an option that depends on high throughput unless other wording implies that capacity exists. If a scenario does not mention a dedicated operations team, you should be cautious about answers that require constant tuning, frequent manual changes, or deep expertise to keep stable. Missing details can also mean the exam wants you to choose a conservative design that is robust under uncertainty, rather than a design that only works if the unstated conditions happen to be perfect. The key is to treat gaps as uncertainty, not as permission to make optimistic assumptions. Architects earn trust by being explicit about assumptions, and the exam rewards that mindset through the answer choices it makes available. A frequent source of confusion is vague terms, so translate words like secure or fast into measurable expectations that can guide architecture. Secure can mean strong authentication and authorization, encryption in transit and at rest, segmentation that limits blast radius, logging that supports investigation, or compliance evidence that satisfies auditors, and you need the scenario to tell you which is dominant. Fast can mean low latency for interactive users, high throughput for bulk processing, predictable jitter for media, or quick recovery after failure, and each meaning drives different design choices. Reliable can mean high availability, graceful degradation, data integrity guarantees, or predictable performance under load, and those are not interchangeable. When you translate vague terms into measurable expectations, you gain the ability to test answer options, because you can ask which option most directly achieves the measurable outcome. This also prevents you from picking an option that sounds aligned with the vague term, but actually optimizes the wrong metric. Non-functional requirements often shape architecture more than features ever do, and scenario prompts usually include at least one non-functional requirement that should dominate your decision. Non-functional requirements include things like availability targets, recovery behavior, auditability, performance constraints, and operational maintainability, and they determine whether an architecture is viable. Features describe what a system does, but non-functional requirements describe how well it must do it and under what conditions it must keep doing it. In many exam questions, multiple answers can provide the feature, such as connecting users to an application, but only one answer respects the non-functional constraints implied by the story. If you find yourself drawn to an answer because it offers a feature that the prompt never asked for, that is often a sign you are being led by distraction. Architects prioritize viability and constraints before they decorate solutions with extras, and that is exactly what best answer logic is testing. To keep your analysis grounded, group requirements into identity, network, application, and operations buckets first, because this organizes thinking without adding complexity. Identity includes who is allowed to access what, under which conditions, with which evidence, and how you prove and revoke that access. Network includes how traffic moves, where boundaries exist, where inspection happens, and how segmentation reduces trust and contains compromise. Application includes workload behavior, dependencies, data flows, and how the application handles failure, scale, and updates. Operations includes monitoring, logging, change management, incident response, and the human reality of maintaining the system day after day. When you bucket requirements this way, you avoid overfitting to a single domain, such as assuming every problem is purely networking or purely security tooling. It also makes contradictions easier to see, because you can tell whether a requirement is really about identity, but is being expressed as a network request, or whether an operations constraint makes an application-level solution unrealistic. When requirements conflict, use a priority stack to resolve conflicts without arguing details, because arguing details usually means you have not agreed on what matters most. A priority stack is simply an ordered ranking of what must be optimized first, second, and third based on the scenario, which might be security over performance, or availability over cost, or compliance over simplicity. The purpose is not to deny the lower priorities, it is to choose which trade-offs are acceptable when no design can optimize everything at once. In exam scenarios, the prompt often signals the top priority with consequences, such as regulatory penalties, revenue loss, or safety impact, and you should treat those signals as decisive. Once you have a priority stack, you can judge options consistently because you are no longer switching criteria midstream. This is how architects avoid endless debates, and it is how you avoid second-guessing after narrowing to two plausible answers. After priorities are clear, check feasibility by asking what must exist before deployment begins, because many designs fail not in theory but in prerequisites. Feasibility here is about dependencies such as identity systems, connectivity, governance, monitoring, and change control, which must be in place before an architecture can function safely. If an option assumes a mature identity provider, but the scenario hints that identity is fragmented or unmanaged, that option may be unrealistic for the environment described. If an option assumes high reliability connectivity between environments, but the scenario hints at intermittent links, that option may violate the uptime requirement. If an option assumes an experienced operations team, but the scenario hints at limited skill level or high turnover, then complexity becomes a risk multiplier. In exam terms, feasibility often separates a clever answer from the best answer, because the best answer is the one that can actually be executed within the scenario constraints. Architects win by designing the path to reality, not just the end state. To make success obvious and prevent endless interpretation, create acceptance criteria so every stakeholder can agree on whether the requirement has been met. Acceptance criteria are measurable tests that prove the design achieved the intended outcome, such as defined recovery time, defined audit evidence, defined performance thresholds, or defined access control outcomes. Even when the exam does not use the phrase acceptance criteria, it often implies it through words like ensure, guarantee, comply, or meet, which are all claims that require verification. When you think in acceptance criteria, you naturally choose designs that are observable and testable because they can prove compliance and performance rather than merely claiming it. This also helps you avoid choosing options that hide complexity behind vague assurances, because if you cannot define how you would prove success, the design is likely too hand-wavy. In practice, acceptance criteria become the bridge between requirements and architecture, and in the exam, they become the bridge between the prompt and the best answer. A common pitfall is treating preferences as requirements and overbuilding controls needlessly, because not every desire is a constraint, and not every good practice is demanded by the scenario. Preferences show up as words like prefer, would like, ideally, or nice to have, and they should influence decisions only after true requirements are met. Overbuilding controls can harm performance, raise cost, increase operational burden, and even reduce availability, which means you can accidentally violate the real goal while chasing an optional improvement. In scenario questions, overbuilding often appears as answers that add multiple layers of tooling, multiple integrations, or heavy inspection everywhere, even when the prompt asked for a simpler improvement. The best answer usually delivers the requirement with the minimum necessary control surface because that reduces the chance of misconfiguration and reduces long-term drift. Architects respect the difference between essential constraints and optional enhancements, and that restraint is a skill the exam quietly measures. To strengthen this skill, practice paraphrasing the requirement aloud, then restate it simpler once, because clarity improves when you force yourself to say it as a single, clean sentence. The first paraphrase should preserve the scenario language, including environment and constraints, and it should capture what success looks like. The second restatement should remove jargon and compress it into an outcome statement, such as, users must access this service reliably from 2 locations without violating compliance requirements. When you can do this, you stop being distracted by the decorative details and start focusing on the architecture-driving facts. This also helps you detect when you have misunderstood the prompt, because if your restatement does not align with the scenario's emphasis, you will feel that mismatch immediately. In exam conditions, this is a mental check that protects you from picking a technically impressive answer that solves the wrong problem. For a mini review, pull the key elements from memory by listing the goal, constraints, dependencies, and acceptance tests, because those 4 items are the minimum architecture story you need. The goal is the business outcome that defines why the work matters, and it should be one sentence that you can defend. Constraints are the limits that define what is allowed, including compliance, geography, latency, uptime, and operational skill level, and they disqualify options that contradict them. Dependencies are what must exist first, such as identity services, connectivity, monitoring, and governance, and they determine feasibility in the scenario's reality. Acceptance tests define how you prove success to stakeholders, which forces you to favor designs that are observable, auditable, and testable. When you can recall these 4 items quickly, you can read a scenario prompt like an architect and evaluate answer choices without getting lost. In the conclusion of Episode 4, titled Reading Requirements Like an Architect, What the Question is Really Asking, the aim is to make requirement interpretation a repeatable habit rather than a guess. You separate business outcome from technical request, identify constraints including compliance, geography, latency, uptime, and operational skill level, and you treat missing details as uncertainty that must be handled carefully. You translate vague terms into measurable expectations. Recognize that non-functional requirements often shape architecture more than features, and bucket requirements into identity, network, application, and operations to keep the analysis balanced. You resolve conflicts with a priority stack, check feasibility by noticing prerequisites, and create acceptance criteria so success is unambiguous. Apply this method to your next planning conversation today, and you will notice that both exam questions and real-world design discussions become clearer, calmer, and more productive. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.